Welcome back to another book review. Now, full disclosure, I couldn't really put these books in any other type of category, but they're books that I personally consider to be classics. So without further ado, let's do this thing. Now, the first ones I'm going to go over, just kind of get them out of the way, are some children's books that I've had since I was very young. And the first of these is Charlotte's Web, and it's a nice, simple story, and to be perfectly honest, I liked it all the way up until the ending because it's not really what I would consider to be a fully happy ending, but it does introduce kids to the concept of death and what it means. But however, the realizations that the main character goes through by the end of it, I'm not sure if it's the most comforting fact or anything like that, but I'll just leave it at that. You can read it for yourself to see what I mean. Moving on to the next book. If you're someone who's a fan of darker stories, and this one definitely does not have a happy ending, depending on what side you're on, but that's The Spider and the Fly, and it's just very dark. Even every image in the book is in black and white and very like grayscale. But if you like darker stories, that's the book for you. This next one here is a book called Hoot, and I'm sure you guys have heard about that one many a times before. But it's quite popular, like in elementary school, things like that. But basically, you got a group of kids trying to protect a burrowing owl habitat, and they're dealing with all the different obstacles that has to do with that, and dealing with a company that wants to develop the land that said habitat is on. So yeah, if you're into that sort of thing, that's the book for you. Next up, I have The 101 Dalmatians, and this story is told from the point of view of the two main parent dogs of the Dalmatians in the story. And of course, you have the famous Cruella de Vil in there. But what I find interesting about the book is that you learn more things about her character and her tastes that didn't necessarily make it into the movies, like her extremely and flat out grotesque obsession with pepper. And she put pepper on everything. Not only did she put pepper on everything, she overloaded every dish with pepper. And then you have the house that belongs to her called Hell House, I believe, where all the walls were painted red, just like this character is horrendous in more ways than just the fact that she wants to turn a bunch of puppy Dalmatians into a fur coat. But all in all, it was a very enjoyable book, and the her character in general is just fun to read about. No matter how much you hate her and what she represents, I highly recommend it, especially if you have a family. Next up is a simple short story by Judy Blume. It's called Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. And I'll tell you what, if you were a kid, you will find this book absolutely hilarious. And especially if you're a sibling that is constantly terrorized by a younger sibling, you'll find it quite relatable. But yeah, highly recommend that one. It's a good comedic ride for sure. Next up is another popular story called The Tale of Despero. And basically, it follows the story of a mouse born very tiny with his eyes open. And he doesn't exactly fall into the societal expectations of his family and his culture, if you will. But this book also goes on some side tangents as well. I believe it's divided up into four different parts. And each part you follow a different main character's point of view, and by the end of the story, they all kind of come together in this big conflict at the end. But all in all, I found it to be a pretty enjoyable read, especially as a younger person. So this one definitely comes highly recommended, and it's also got a movie adaptation that's an animated film. And they got pretty close to it, for what they had to work with. But all in all, still enjoyable. So next up, we're getting more into the adult level books, and these are ones that I really definitely consider to be classics. And starting off, we have The Red Badge of Courage, which is an older war type book. And honestly speaking, I didn't really enjoy it as much as I thought I would. Maybe I was a bit confused as far as what the message was supposed to be of the book, because you have a point in this story where the main character pretty much just abandons his post, if you will, and flees from the battle. But somehow it gets wrapped up in the end and everything's okay. But it's been a minute since I've read it, but if this is your type of genre, the military style books, you might enjoy it. I personally don't, not to undersell what the military does or anything like that, because I have high respect for them. I just don't enjoy military stories as much as I do other genres, and that's just as simple as that, nothing more or less. That's just where my tastes lie. Moving on from that, we have Around the World in 80 Days. And I actually found this one to be very enjoyable. It's by Jules Verne. And basically, you have this guy who makes a bet with a bunch of other rich guys in the UK that he can make it around the world in 80 days. And you follow his entire journey. He heads east and continues on that fashion until he eventually makes it all the way back around. But it's fun just seeing all the twists and turns and the obstacles that he ran into along the way. He takes a servant along with him as well, and it was really enjoyable. All the different places that he visited, just the level of detail in the book too. As you can tell by how much thicker it is than some of these other ones I'm about to go over. But truly a fun read, and I've seen bits and pieces of the movie, but I'm not sure if they truly captured the soul of what the book is supposed to be, especially towards the very end. But it also follows the story of a detective type individual who's following them on their entire journey, trying to stop him and catch him at the same time for a crime that was committed. But we don't know whether or not our main character is guilty of that crime until the very end. So, more on that later. Hope you guys enjoy that one as much as I did. Next up is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I actually enjoyed this one. It was, tough to follow it in certain points, but overall I found it enjoyable of a read. And it's a very short story too, so it won't take you very much time to get through it. And it's interesting reading how the book actually describes the dynamic between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Most adaptations that you see, they portray Mr. Hyde as to be a completely and totally separate personality or person from Dr. Jekyll. But in reality, if I'm remembering this correctly, it portrayed Dr. Jekyll as also being Mr. Hyde. He himself, Dr. Jekyll, but with all of his inhibitions and his motions and his emotions and empathy, removed pretty much. And the main conflict of the story is not when he finally figures out the formula to turn himself into Mr. Hyde. Things start to go wrong at a certain point. He starts finding it more, I believe, more difficult to come out of the Mr. Hyde form, or he starts waking up and he's already in the form without actually taking the formula, and it just snowballs from there. And it definitely does not have the ending that you would expect. But yeah, I won't spoil anything on that. Hope you guys enjoy that book too. It's called The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and it's by Robert Louis Stevenson. But yeah, moving on to our last book, and out of those last four, I think this one might be my most favorite, and it's called The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. And it really is amazing how many other books out in the world reference this book right here. Like references I wouldn't have understood had I not read this book first. And shortly after, moving into my own house, I had more time to hop into the books that I kind of had backlogged. And I was just shocked at how many books I read and then read books after those books, and those books reference those books. Like I just somehow read them in the perfect order. It was kind of funny. But The Time Machine is probably the most prominent one out of all of those. Like so many books talk about what happens in this book. And like I said, it's by H.G. Wells, not to be confused with Orson Welles, who did the whole War of the Worlds radio prank that broke society for a little while there. Um, but another fun thing about H.G. Wells is all the movie and TV show adaptations of the character that is H.G. Wells, and there's even some books that are fictional books that are written about this person in science fiction type ways. Probably one of my most favorite adaptations of H.G. Wells as a character is in Warehouse 13, where you find out H.G. Wells is actually a woman or something like that, and she causes a bunch of trouble for the main characters in that show. But she's kind of like you think she's a villain, but then she's not a villain, and she just kind of twists and turns. It's all about what her actual goals are at that given time. But she's a super fun character in that show. But anyway, the Time Machine follows the story of a inventor pretty much, and the story is told in the format of him explaining his adventures towards a group of people in his like parlor or whatever. But basically, he invents a time machine somehow and travels all the way to a six-digit year. It was like 700,000 something, 801. 802,701, I believe is what it was. And that was convenient. And basically, he enlightens this group that at some point society advances to a certain point and then falls and degrades, and the human race divides into two different species based off of pretty much natural selection and just genetics through time and all that. You have the race that lives on the surface, the Eloi, and they're like teeny tiny humans, almost like Oompa Loompas, if you will. And they're like, due to the generations and generations of laziness and living cushy lives, they get tired easy, and they're still living in a life in luxury. But there's also a dark side to this. The other race, the race that was more likely enslaved by the other at some point in time, and therefore had better traits, physical traits, down the road due to, through time and genetics. It's the Morlocks, and they live underground in these tunnels, and they're very crafty, good with their hands, inventing. And they actually steal his time machine for a while. They're trying to figure out how it works. But without spoiling how exactly that story goes, he eventually, makes some progress in his goals in that time. And obviously, he had to make it back to his original time in order to tell this story, but I won't tell you how that happens or what goes down. And this book has an ending, but I don't know if I'd call it a happy or sad ending. It's more of an ending that leaves you wondering or guessing, like where did he end up? What actually happened at the very end here? And it doesn't explain that. It almost leaves it open in a way, but obviously the story was never continued because the time traveler isn't back to tell a second story. But all in all, I really enjoyed this read, especially considering how old of a book it is, too. Like, super fun read. Hope you guys enjoy this one as much as I did. But that's all the books for this review, and I hope you guys have a good day.